Hello, my name is Jose Gonzalez, and I'm currently studying my honors program at the University of Waikato, and I'm doing a paper on environmental and resource economics. Today, what I'm going to talk to you guys about is fuel poverty, its determinant drivers, and indirect relationship with the availability of non-renewable resources. This is quite an important topic within New Zealand at the moment, as there is some several, I, I could even say like thousands of houses that are suffering and that are defined under this category of fuel poverty because of lack of resources within New Zealand in terms of fuel. Um, this is a screencast that we have to do for our about our essay that we wrote on this topic and the research commanded. Okay, so first of all, I'm gonna give you a brief overview on the topic at hand, which is really important. We need to know what the case scenario is like in New Zealand, what's been happening in at the policy level, what has been done here and there, and how many people are affected by this, and what are the potential consequences in health. But then we will go more in depth, and we'll talk about the potential consequences that it could have on the living members of a household and a family. We'll discuss them and see how bad it can get for some people, especially depending on the age bracket that you belong to. Secondly, we'll argue that being income constrained will result in different outcomes, but all leading to the same endpoint. So being income constrained will disallow you to access a certain amount of electricity monthly. Thirdly, we shall talk about the overall increased level in prices across fuel sources and how this impacts consumption power within the household. Consequently, we'll discuss the different policies and projects and methods that have been implemented by governmental organizations and also regional ones to deal with fuel poverty. Also, after that, we'll explain the advantages of using other forms of heating, which could be wood or in case we could be talking about natural gas and other things. We will talk about the potential threats that using these means of heating could have in the atmosphere in terms of the environmental stability. And also we'll talk about the low rate of decomposition of the fine particles that comes from smoke of dry wood. After this, we'll talk about the potential policy implication that will suggest that could reduce overall level of prices, increase supply. And lastly, we shall talk about increasing quality of life as a result of this new policy. So first of all, fuel poverty within New Zealand. So in New Zealand, we have about 25% of the New Zealand households are affected by this concept of fuel poverty. So they are living in low temperatures and low inside temperature houses. So basically they are facing the risk, the potential health risks that this carry with it. Also, according to Boardman, it is when Boardman, it was in a study that Lloyd did. He's a professor from the University of Otago, and he specializes on this area. So he cited Boardman in his paper when he said that it is when the cost of fuel to heat a home up, according to the parameters established, has to be more than 10% of a household's income in order to achieve that warmth environment. This is pretty high standards, 10% of a, let's say, weekly average income. It is a lot of money. Think about it. People are income constrained. They have to divide their budget among different goods and services, and electricity is one of their major drivers, I guess, and major expenses. Also, the potential health risks are as a result of low temperature. They could be cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. We have a decrease in quality of life as well, due to income inequality. So if we have lower income, we'll know that 10% of that low income will be less than that 10% of that higher income. So therefore, we'll have a lower quality of life as well, as we will be able to spend less amount of money in heating up the houses to those temperatures established. And also the main sources of heating overall in New Zealand are wood, electricity, and fire. Sorry about that, it's not fire, it's natural gas. We made a mistake right there. It's natural gas. And also the overall level of prices is something that drives fuel poverty, because the price for electricity per kilowatt has been going up significantly lately, and is something that's going to drive our changes. Okay, so temperature standards and impacts on the health state. According to Lloyd, the British defined heating structures as having a temperature of 21 Celsius degrees in main living areas, such as the kitchen, I guess, if you share the kitchen, the living area, the common room, those sorts of things. And then other rooms in the house have to be at 18 degrees Celsius. Anything below this threshold has a consequence on the overall health state. High levels of condensation. We know that if the lower the temperature that it's inside the house, the high level of condensation that we will have, because it will react to the um, to that heat, to that temperature of the outside. So, or whenever we turn water on, or whenever we have cold houses, cold temperature rooms, there will be a high level of condensation, which will create moldy surfaces and damp surfaces. So, colder houses, it's correlated with moldy and damp surfaces, which is harder to keep the room temperature up to the standards like this, because moldy and damp surfaces, they cannot keep warmth inside the house. They make it colder. So we need more energy to heat up the house. Also, it affects children because they have a weaker immune system. This is the age bracket that we were talking about. And also older people tend to spend more time inside the household, so they will be more affected by colder temperatures. And the mainly sort of health consequences that it could have on humans, it could be respiratory and infectious illnesses in terms of the symptoms presented, sort of having a cold, and all sort of diseases and viruses and bacteria that you could get from living in cold temperatures. Also, a study shows that colder houses is correlated with high mortality. So what this study showed from the Ministry of Social Development is that the 10% of the colder houses, they had a higher mortality rate than the 10% of the warmest households within New Zealand. And also, well, we could call it that certain diseases are correlated with the fact that they are not living in an ideal household atmosphere and temperature, and this is why they could be passing away. Okay, so the income constraints. So a study done by the Ministry of Social Development as well showed correlation between income and expenditure, and saying that when expenditure went up, when income was up, we had a higher amount of expenditure spending in energy. That's pretty obvious, we have a higher available salaries and wages and money to spend in our power bill, so we are able to distribute our budget more evenly. The problem that with this study is that it lacked statistically significance, so it had a really big p-value. And we know that when we run a t-test, we can get our p-value, and if it's bigger, we fail to reject the null, that it could be 0. So to account for this statistical significance, we will explain a model in budget constraints. So we have a household, we have an income, right? Our income could be divided between clothing, good 1, and then the good 2 could be electricity. And the way we calculate the amount of money spent on each good, it could be income divided by the price, which QX1 will be the quantity bought in terms of for clothing, and then income divided by PX2 will be the quantity bought for electricity. Let's say it could be per kilowatt, right? So what happens here is that to account for this lack of a statistical significance, so there's certain variation that is not being explained in terms of saying that even if we had the same income, we could be spending more in clothing, we'll have to be giving up one good for the other one. So we're accounting for this in terms of saying that if people were irrational and they had lower income and they wanted to spend more money in energy, they will still substitute from that clothing sector, and they will have to spend less money in clothing and more money in electricity. So this will lead to the same endpoint, which means they will be exposed to lower temperatures with less layers of clothing on, which will have the same health consequences as heating up the household more. So there has to be an equilibrium and a balance between these two, because we only have a certain amount of QX1 and QX2 that we can get with a given income. And if we distribute among these two, we can substitute from one to the other one and remain on the same utility level, right? But we're going to get the same out of one and the other one, the same endpoint. Okay, so in terms of explaining the increasing overall level of prices, we can explain that the prices for electricity, natural gas, and fuel oil from 2009 to 2013, they have gone up significantly. In terms of change to change, which means percentage change, from 2009 to 2013, electricity has increased by 23.7%. The prices are in cents per kilowatt. Natural gas has increased for 21.7%, which is a lot of money. Fuel oil is the major driver of this increase, which is 26.9%. This was gathered from the Ministry of Business and Innovation. The overall, we can see a significant price increase across the main fuel sources, which is what we explained before. So if there is a higher level of prices, the consumption power for private houses will decrease. This is correlated somehow with income, right? Why? Because the average household weekly income in New Zealand from 2009 to 2013, so the same dates that we looked at the prices of fuel sources, have increased by only 16.9% from 1,459 dollars to $1,760. So there hasn't been the same adjustments in terms of wages for workers as it has been the increase in overall level of prices for fuel sources. So we've had to distribute our budget and maybe even spend more money in electricity now because it's more expensive, money that we do not have because these wages and these salaries are not at the same, they haven't increased at the same level that the overall levels of prices. Let's put it this way. Let's see, we have $1,400 to spend in kilowatts of electricity for 23.30 cents. If we divide our income of 2009 divided by the price of 2009, we'll get a greater quantity. We'll get a greater QX1 in our budget constraint, right? I mean our budget distribution. And then if we divide $1,760 divided by the new price of the kilowatt, of cents per kilowatt, which is 27.59, we will get a less amount of QX1, which is the quantity that we're able to demand, the amount of kilowatts that we're able to demand weekly for our household. This will be lower because we have a higher income and we have a lower quantity because the labor prices have gone up by more than the level of income. Okay, the governmental and regional policies, there's been better insulation material use and higher construction criterion implemented since 1978, as there was tighter rules for building projects and for building firms in terms of the insulation material that they were meant to use, and also the building of the walls and ceilings and all these sorts of things that before 1978 there was not strict rules on this because New Zealand is a country that experiences a mild winter, which means there is no need for such tight regulations. Better insulation means higher room temperature at normal state, which means we'll have less damp surfaces and moldy walls as well, which will lead to, I guess, less amount of money needed to be spent on of heating devices or wood or natural gas or any fuel sources. So 65% of the houses weren't built after 1978, so this means that all the other people are before the regulation was implemented, so they are likely to be affected more by the cold temperatures of winter. The way they promote this is by the Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority, which enhances and promotes households to improve their insulation by subsidizing it. So if they present a plan, they will help them build a project within their household and improve their insulation. They address this income constraint on households, but the government addresses constraints, but they do not target the main problem, which is lack of availability of resources. So if we look at the use of other means of heating, which is used as a wood, it could be a good potential substitute for heating instead of using electricity. The only problem is that dry wood takes a long time to, like from 6 to 12 months to dry. The problem is that wood normally, it could be the use of wood could be compensated in terms of the rate of decomposition could be low if there was a good level of quality of wood used, and it could be environmentally feasible. In terms of reduction in money spent, because wood is cheaper, we pay less, we get it for free sometimes, we can cut it from our own backyard, from our friend, and I'm pretty sure that a log of firewood is pretty cheap in comparison to what you see in fuels on the normal fuel sources. Its accessibility in terms of cost, there is a lot of cost that it could have. The rate of decomposition is really slow. The fine particles that come out from wet wood that's being burned, because people benefit their present sort of state over their future one. So in terms of in saying that, they will use any type of wood they get, contaminated one, once they have high levels of contaminants like such as paint or other components that could be within the wood that they will, if burned, they will have a higher level of contamination going out to the atmosphere in fine particles that they are highly toxic for the human body as well, just as toxic as it could be said as like second-hand smoking or first-hand smoking. They are really, let's say, bad overall. So they could be also wrong human behavior that we could expect. People using not proper wood instead of dry wood, they will use wet wood or they will use contaminated wood. and they will privilege your present for future benefits. And also in Auckland, 72% of fine particles comes from wood burnt over winter, which is quite significant in saying that most of the contamination in this area comes from this sector. Also, use of natural gas and oil to produce electricity. We have total amount of gigawatts are 43,000. Out of this 43,000 of electricity production, it was 8,000 come from natural gas, and also 3,000 come from coal and oil. So they use natural gas and coal and oil to produce electricity. Therefore, and also 12,307 of the total demand comes from the residential sector, so which is 31.8%, which is significant and is greater than the commercial sector, the industrial, and other sectors, the public sector as well. We can see that New Zealand relies heavily on natural gas production and oil, and they could benefit from it because this is used as one of the factors of production to produce electricity itself that goes into the households, which could lead to lower prices and greater supply. Therefore, its ability will affect prices overall. Then we have policy implementation, promote and increasing production of relevant resources. If we expand the amount of natural gas, we're likely to see a greater amount of oil and gas available within New Zealand in the long term, which means XT plus 1, which is the amount left of stock after we've had the harvesting period, which is minus XT. So XT minus 1 could be the next year, and that's the stock left for next year after the amount harvested this year is above 0, which means we'll have a greater amount of stock if we actually produce more oil and produce more natural gas. So people will have, in New Zealand, there will be a greater amount of, let's say, electricity available for everyone to be used, which will, according to Conrad, this is what we got taught in class, that having a greater stock of resources could lower extraction costs, future extraction costs, and increase future rates of extraction. So it means we will be increasing the amount of oil and natural gas that is being extracted yearly in New Zealand. Greater harvesting capacity leads to a higher amount of electricity. As we said, this will result in lower prices according to the Energy Information Association from the USA. They have done a study that sort of proves this. Oil can be used as a substitute for gas for the power generators, which is really good. So if we decide to extract oil instead of gas, we could be used them as substitutes, one from the other one, to create electricity from the power generators. Also in the South Island offshore drilling, there's a potential for 8 basins around New Zealand. This is one of them. 120 million barrels, that's a stock available, that's been unexploited, because oil drilling, it's really controversial in terms of the amount of contamination and spillovers that could happen and kill living things in the water. $170 million per region. If project was implemented, that's a lot of money. There could be a potential increase in wages, just like how it happened in Taranaki. The basin in Taranaki is being exploited at the moment, and there's still extraction going on, and they are the highest GDP per capita region in the country with $50,000. Policy passed by government in which they want to increase competition among electricity producers in such a way that they can lower prices and increase supply. So there has been already policies trying to target for greater competition and greater supply in the electricity sector. Calculations of potential oil production in New Zealand. So the current as 2015 around New Zealand is about 35,000 barrels per day, the amount of production of oil that's been extracted, especially from the Taranaki Basin. Potential barrels per day, if the new project was implemented, we said that there could be 120 million barrels per day in this offshore drilling of the South Island. If we divide this by 14 years is the production and extraction period, we will get 8,571,439 barrels per year. That's a lot of oil that's being produced yearly. And then if we divide this by 365, we will get the amount of barrels per day. And then we can compare it to the total amount that New Zealand is currently producing per day. 23,483 compared to 35,000. It almost makes up for the full amount that New Zealand is currently producing. If we look at the change to change, so if we sum up these two values and then we calculate the previous value of it, we could say there's a 63% increase, which is, this number has to be 58,000, and this is a 63% increase in the amount of oil produced within New Zealand. In terms of potential future benefits in present values, if we use a discount factor, which is to calculate the amount of value present, the amount of future value in the present. We could calculate the amount of regional GDP that could potentially benefit everyone if we use a discount factor formula and at a fixed discount rate, because we know society is patient. We know New Zealand is a patient society. They are willing to invest in the long term, and they are not actually presently focused. They want to carefully invest on their future as an economy. And also we have in the formula, we have two incognitas, you could call them. You have the hash, you have that big N, which is years of extraction, and then you have 1 plus alpha, you could call it an alpha, and that alpha is the discount rate. We have to include in our discount factor, which is the amount of the present value of money with the alpha, because it's the discount rate, the cost of borrowing money in the future, in the brought to the present. Plug in an alpha into our formula, we get 1 divided by 1 plus 0.03, sorry, and all this we take it to the power of 14 and we multiply by 557 million. That's going to give us the present value of this potential project of the offshore drilling, and that's equal to $368,242,617. That's a lot of money for the regional GDP. Increasing quality of life. Why? Because if we have a greater stock and a greater amount of harvested, people will have a greater access, greater supply, and they will have better access to cheaper electricity, which means that they can pay less for natural gas, which is one of the main sources of heating as well, and also pay less for electricity, because we know natural gas and coal and oil are used as factors of production within the generation of electricity as in its pure nature. And also we can have a welfare gain, efficiency gain, because people are going to be able to get a greater consumer surplus. As we said, there's going to be a shift of the supply curve, a rightward shift, according to according to the Energy Information Association from USA, which would say with a greater quantity supply, we have a lower price and a greater quantity demanded, which means there's going to be an increase in overall welfare. This could potentially show as a better allocation of resources now, that more resources are being used in something that we're good at and something that we could exploit that hasn't been exploited yet, and it's a potential economical benefit for New Zealand. We'll have an increasing consumption power now. Households will be able to use their money for other purposes such as education, right? Education is really important, health, and other things that could increase their quality of life, because greater supply, lower prices, higher quantity demanded, which means people are going to be able to heat up their houses to the temperatures expected. Our percentage of people suffering fuel poverty will decrease, and we'll have people having a higher income to distribute it among services and basic necessities that could potentially increase their quality of life. So overall, it's a win-win solution for everyone if the offshore sea drilling of the South Island is implemented. In terms of conclusion, we have seen our research throughout this paper. It can be said that there is a numerous factors that condition a family's power to access the optimal level of electricity required to heat up a household. A lot of constraints, income constraints, price constraints, the amount of resources available within New Zealand, the temperatures, the health conditions, the housing regulations, all these sorts of things that will condition the outcome. There has been several regulations proposed by the government, none of them addressing the direct issue, which is the lack of availability of primarily important resources such as oil and natural gas within the country. So we talked about this. According to our findings, the project suggested could potentially solve the major difficulty of fuel poverty within New Zealand. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. Hope you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you guys sometime soon. See you later.